The arrival at Hollow's End, they say the hills beyond Charleston still hum at night, as if something buried deep beneath the soil has learned how to breathe. I did not believe such things then. I do now. Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. The first record of the Forsyth estate appears in a county ledger dated March 3rd, 1859, though local oral accounts suggest the property existed long before its legal recognition. Built along the swamp road near Hollow's End, it stood as a grand but hollow imitation of a Virginia manor, 3 stories of brick, whitewashed to hide the creeping mold that bloomed through the mortar. Its owner, Dr. Nathaniel Forsyth, had relocated from Boston following the death of his wife and son during the winter of 1858. What he sought there is uncertain. The official explanation reads simply, to establish a private facility for anatomical research. But the townsfolk called it the House of Return, as if it gathered back what the earth had already claimed. From my research among the scattered parish papers and fading diaries, it seems Forsyth was a man of immaculate self-control, precise, rational, and unflinchingly clinical. Yet even his notes from the earliest months betray a slow erosion of that composure. His handwriting trembles by May, his tone turns inward, addressing not readers but someone just out of reach. The estate had been built atop the remnants of a burned chapel, and it was there that Forsyth installed his lecture wing, a narrow series of rooms whose windows were nailed shut from the inside. Several workmen later testified that strange crates were delivered weekly, unmarked except for a small seal, a serpent coiled around a cruciform rod. When questioned, Forsyth claimed they contained imported medical specimens from the university at Edinburgh. But the workmen knew the smell of bodies. By the summer of that same year, Hollow's End began to change. Livestock miscarried. Trees on the northern boundary bled sap the color of rust. The river, which once ran clear, turned a shade of amber so thick it clung to the stones. Still, the doctor persisted. A surviving letter from his assistant, Miles Tremont, mentions the beginning of a second phase of study, familial replication. The phrasing is careful, almost coded. It suggests that Forsyth's pursuit had shifted from anatomy towards something more hereditary, some continuity of form that defied ordinary death. Neighbors, already uneasy, began reporting thin figures wandering the fields near midnight. They were not trespassers, the witnesses swore, but the same farmhands who had gone missing months before. Each sighting described the same detail, the eyes, pale as river glass, reflecting light where none existed. And then, abruptly, the letters stopped. The ledger ends mid-sentence. A single final entry, dated October 12, 1859, was found folded into a church registry decades later, brittle and stained. It reads, "They return to me in perfect likeness, yet something in the marrow resists command. I have made the error of giving memory to flesh." That was the last trace of Dr. Nathaniel Forsyth. The estate still stands. Locals claim its windows never cloud with dust, though no one leaves there now. On humid nights, the soil steams as if the ground itself exhales. And sometimes, travelers say, if you pause near the gates at Hollow's End, you'll hear someone inside calling your name, softly, as though they've been waiting for you a very long time. The ledger room, the earliest known inventory of the Forsyth estate, was discovered not in a courthouse or archive, but in the attic of a decaying rectory 2 towns east. The document, bound in damp leather, bore the title Household Ledgers, March-August 1859. Its ink had bled in several places, but certain entries remained legible, enough to trace the slow unraveling of order within those walls. March 7, 2 new attendants hired from Savannah, both ill-suited for delicate work. Recommend instruction in the preservation of material. March 14 specimens A through D arrived intact, a show's promise. Must adjust salinity for tissue elasticity. The handwriting, precise and looping, matched that of Dr. Nathaniel Forsyth himself, but by late April another hand begins to intrude. Unsteady, slanted, written in what appears to be graphite rather than ink. It belonged, I believe, to Miles Tremont, his assistant. The tone of those later notes changes from administrative to pleading. He insists they speak to him when the lamps are low, says they answer in the same voice as his son. By June, the number of recorded specimens had grown from 4 to 13. Each entry is labeled with an initial and followed by a peculiar remark, responsive to light, pulse resumed, incomplete vocality. What disturbs most is that Tremont, in a marginal note, claims one of the specimens bore the same birthmark as Forsyth's late wife. The ledger then turns erratic. Items once measured in ounces and hours become described in abstractions. Days uncounted, work continuous. Then, abruptly, rooms sealed. According to parish gossip collected years later, the servants who worked the kitchen wing refused to approach the lower floors after nightfall. They spoke of faint coughing sounds echoing through the vent shafts, as though patients lay beneath the floorboards. Yet no infirmary was ever documented in the estate's blueprints. By midsummer, the Forsyth name had vanished from the Charleston medical listings. Letters from the university went unanswered. One former colleague wrote that Nathaniel's theories concerning regeneration and inherited essence had drawn ridicule among anatomists. His funding was likely withdrawn soon after, but isolation suited him. His final months suggest deliberate exile. On August 2nd, 1859, the ledger includes its last coherent entry. The 10th subject retained cognition for nearly 3 hours. It remembered its own name. That name, written faintly beneath, is Elinor. Whether this was his wife reborn through some anatomical blasphemy, or merely an illusion wrought by grief, cannot be proven. What is known is that the estate's activity ceased within a week of that note. Shipments halted, servants dismissed without pay. The town physician who rode out to Hollow's End found the gates barred and the windows boarded. Only Tremont remained. His signature appears on a single requisition for 20 pounds of crushed gypsum and 4 gallons of carbolic. There are no further mentions of him in any local record. When I visited the site last winter, the air inside the house still held the odor of old disinfectant. Dust lay undisturbed except along a single path between the study and the cellar door, fresh enough to suggest recent passage. And carved faintly into the wood of the cellar's threshold, beneath layers of varnish, was one word scratched again and again until the grain splintered: remember. The cellar observations by early autumn of 1859, the Forsyth estate had grown silent above ground. Fields were unharvested, doors barred, and the upper windows shrouded in black muslin. But below, the cellar, life persisted in ways no sane record should preserve. The following account derives from a set of water-damaged notebooks recovered during the 1903 excavation of Hollow's End. These fragments are attributed to Miles Tremont, though the ink tremors suggest a hand no longer steady. The pages describe the cellar in obsessive detail: 4 chambers cut into the original foundation, stone-lined, lime-washed, drainage trench leading east toward the marsh. What he names the observation hall appears to have been the central vault, a place not of storage but of demonstration. The first entries remain almost procedural. Tremont lists ratios of saline temperature control, the use of voltaic current to reinvigorate latent tissue. It reads like any physician's log. Yet as the pages progress, the tone falters, grammar disintegrates, and confession seeps through the precision. Dr. Forsyth speaks to them as if they are only asleep. He believes he can awaken memory if the body is reminded of its shape. He writes that the doctor began drawing blood from his own veins, introducing it into preserved specimens in what he called familial transference. It was not resurrection he sought, but inheritance, a transmission of self, blood to blood, generation to generation, without the need for birth. By September 10th, the experiments took on a human rhythm. Tremont notes that one of the forms began to breathe unassisted, though no heart was present. He describes a trembling beneath the ribs, as though something unseen tested the confines of its cage. He begged to end the trial. Forsyth refused. A later page is smeared with fingerprints, the graphite almost erased. Still legible are 3 words, "She opened her eyes." The handwriting that follows appears frantic, hurried between candle burns and ink blots. Tremont claims the cellar became filled with a low hum like the resonance of a tuning fork pressed against bone. Every instrument failed, mercury glass shattered, copper wires blackened. He writes of Forsyth kneeling beside the table, whispering the name Eleanor again and again until the voice that answered did not sound human. Neighbors reported that same week a strange glow through the swamp mist, as though lanterns burned beneath the soil. No one approached. Even the post riders avoided the lane after dark. One account from a farmer's daughter, preserved in a court affidavit from October 2nd, describes a woman in white walking barefoot through the field, her face covered as if ashamed. The next morning, the farmer found his livestock collapsed in their pens, eyes open, bodies unmarked. The cellar notebooks end without conclusion. The final page bears only a single sentence, centered as though meant for a reader. The body remembers what the soul forgets. When authorities finally entered Hollow's End years later, they found the cellar sealed with plaster, floor flooded, and all trace of laboratory apparatus dissolved in rust. Only one object remained intact, a glass vessel containing a lock of auburn hair suspended in clear fluid. The tag attached to it had faded almost to nothing, but under certain light, 2 letters could still be read, E, F. Some claim the hum still rises from beneath the foundations when the air grows heavy before rain. The ground shivers, not like thunder, but like something struggling to breathe below. The night of Hollow's End winter arrived early that year, heavy and wet. The marsh froze in slick patches, and the cypress trees stood like sentinels in mourning. Those who still lived near Hollow's End swore that the ground steamed even in frost, as if the soil itself exhaled something unholy from beneath. By December, only the doctor and his assistant remained within the estate. The rest had fled. The official record for December 18th, 1859, lists a storm of unusual violence tearing through St. Vienne parish, but local testimony speaks of something else a night when thunder came not from the sky, but from underground. It began shortly after dusk. Tremont, in his final letter never meant for delivery, writes that Forsyth had summoned the congregation to witness the reclamation. No congregation was recorded, only 5 figures whose names appeared nowhere else in the archives: Alden, Harrow, Finch, Voss, and Meyerill. Neighbors believed they were scholars, but the coroner's notes suggest otherwise. The bodies later found near the marsh bore the marks of confinement and restraint. Tremont wrote of the cellar that night, torches burning blue, air thick with the copper scent of spilled blood. The doctor stood over the slab where Eleanor's body had once lain, though Tremont noted the flesh had darkened, hardened, as if cured by time itself. Around the slab, sigils had been carved into the stone floor, filled with mercury. Forsyth believed the element could conduct memory, bridging flesh and consciousness. When the first lightning struck the marsh, the house shook. Bottles clattered from shelves, glass burst, and the instruments shivered like nervous teeth. Tremont begged to stop, but Forsyth raised his hand commanding silence. The air changed. The torches bent backward, flames drawn toward the slab as if by breath. Tremont claimed he heard whispering, then not from the doctor, but from the body itself. "She knows my name," Forsyth whispered. "She remembers. The storm outside howled. The shutters tore loose. In that chaos, something moved on the table, a twitch, a pulse, a tremor that grew into convulsion." Tremont dropped his notes. He writes that the room brightened light without flame, cold and without color, and every shadow in the cellar stood upright as though they had weight. Then came the scream. Not human, not animal, the sound of every trapped breath from years past escaping at once. He fled then up the stairs, through the parlor, but the door would not open. The hinges swelled, he wrote. The wood pulsed as though alive. From behind him, Forsyth's voice broke into sobs, pleading for mercy. Tremont turned and saw him on his knees before the slab, holding the thing that had once been his wife. Her face was pale, features blurred as if unfinished, yet her eyes those were awake, and they did not see him. They saw through him. By dawn Hollow's End burned. The fire spread from cellar to roof before anyone could intervene. The parish ledger records 6 dead, 5 guests and 1 assistant. Forsyth's remains were never found. Only Tremont's journal survived, half charred, retrieved from a drainage ditch 2 miles east. Witnesses who arrived at sunrise reported that the snow around the ruins had melted in a perfect circle, the earth black and wet. In the center of that circle lay a single object, a pearl hairpin melted at the tip, engraved faintly with the initials E.F. Even now, when the wind sweeps across Hollow's End, the cypress trees sway out of rhythm with the breeze. Locals say it is the doctor's house breathing still, or the thing he brought back, whispering from the pit beneath the frost. The records of 1860, when the estate of Hollow's End was seized by parish order in March of 1860, the sheriff's men expected ruins. What they found instead was something preserved eerily so. The upper floors were reduced to skeletal beams, but the cellar had endured, untouched by fire or frost. Every tool, vial, and ledger remained where it had been left. The air below was heavy, damp, metallic, as if the smoke had never reached that far. Among the salvaged items was a single trunk sealed with iron clasps, bearing the name Dr. W. H. Forsyth. It was carried to St. Vienne Courthouse for inventory. When opened, the men recoiled. The contents were not personal effects nor valuables, but a collection of medical specimens preserved in thick glass, floating in amber fluid. Each jar bore a paper label in Forsyth's fine hand. No. 3 failed restoration. No. 5 viable breath sample. No. 7 partial response E.F. A clerk, young and curious, noted in his log that one jar seemed to tremble as if stirred by some unseen current. His supervisor ordered it destroyed. It was not. The trunk was quietly moved to the parish infirmary, stored beneath the stairs, and forgotten for nearly 2 decades. What survived from that night came mostly from Assistant Tremont's final letters, recovered by the coroner and entered into record. His handwriting deteriorates sharply after the events of December. He describes nights spent dreaming of a white figure at the edge of the marsh, of voices rising from water though none were near, and the unmistakable sound of breathing through glass. In one passage dated February 11, 1860, he writes, "The sound persists. Even with cotton in my ears, I hear it. The jars were not sealed against the soul. I see her lips move in my sleep, not as they were in life, but stiff, blistered. She mouths my name, though her throat was long gone." He died a week later, officially listed as a suicide, though the report notes the unusual placement of his body. Tremont had been found seated upright at his desk, pen still in hand, eyes wide open, staring toward an empty corner of the room. On the wall behind him, written in a smear of ink, were the words, "The Marsh remembers. After Tremont's death, the sheriff ordered Hollow's End boarded and sealed, yet the boards never stayed fixed." Each spring, workers sent to resecure them reported that nails had worked loose, though the wood was dry. On one occasion, the boards had been pried outward from within. In June of 1860, Father Bellamy of St. Vienne Parish delivered a sermon titled "Of Man's Arrogance Before the Body," loosely referencing the Forsyth case without naming it. He warned of those who think to bind the soul to muscle, and the stench of false resurrection. The congregation listened, but few spoke after. They said that when the priest passed the old estate later that week, he found water flooding the path, though the marsh had not risen for months. The courthouse trunk was never officially logged after that summer. The records stop abruptly at an entry marked with a single line, "Transferred to medical authority for study, not display," which authority remains unclear. Some believe it was moved to the newly founded Louisiana School of Anatomy, others to a private collector in New Orleans. Either way, no trace of the Forsyth specimens ever appeared again in parish archives. Still, in years when fog clings too long over the lowlands, fishermen tell of bubbles surfacing where no current should be, and the faint chime of glass striking glass beneath the black water. The Anatomy Ledger in July of 1861, an unmarked shipment arrived at the Louisiana School of Anatomy in Baton Rouge. The war had begun that spring, and the school had become a refuge for physicians, surgeons, and opportunists seeking to turn battlefield tragedy into study. The manifest listed the cargo as medical preparations for research, but the custodian who signed for the crates, Mr. Lyle Greaves, recorded a peculiar note beside the entry. "Containers vibrate faintly like a heartbeat beneath glass." The shipment bore no sender's name, only the initials W.H.F. burned into the lid of the largest crate. The director at the time, Dr. Matheson Held, dismissed Greaves' concern. He ordered the specimens transferred to the sub-basement archive, alongside preserved organs and formaldehyde, soaked limbs gathered from battlefield surgeries. Students were told they were from an abandoned estate in St. Vienne Parish. None knew the name Forsyth. Weeks later, Hald began a new ledger. The entries, dry, clinical, describe experiments that mirrored Forsyth's theories, the reactivation of cellular memory through exposure to mercury and static discharge. His tone was detached, but his fascination evident. He referred repeatedly to the responsive specimen, which he labeled simply E7. E7 exhibits signs of residual motion when current is applied. No visible decay despite exposure. Form remains anatomically correct but exhibits anomalous heat patterns. Ledger 1861, entry no. 14. In late August, students reported hearing faint music drifting from the lower levels after dark, a low humming, as if from within the walls. Greaves was sent to investigate. His report to Dr. Hald survives in fragment. No pipes burst, no wind through vents, yet sound persists, feels alive vibrating the teeth. 2 days later, he resigned and left the city without collecting pay. By September 3rd, Hald's notes grew erratic. Ink blotted, handwriting slanted, margins filled with sketches of nerves branching into roots, veins twining into vines. His entries became less about anatomy and more about communion. She recognizes me now. The flicker behind the eyelids responds to my words. I have learned her name not given, but remembered, Elinor. The following week, during a demonstration for visiting physicians, the generator powering the static coil failed. Witnesses recall a loud crack, then a surge that extinguished every lamp in the building. When light returned, the lower floor was empty. Dr. Hald was gone. The specimen jars had burst, scattering glass and fluid across the tiled floor. In the center of the room, a single smear of blood led toward the drainage channel that emptied into the river. The ledger ends abruptly with an unfinished sentence. The pulse continues beyond observation. That winter, riverboats reported strange debris drifting downstream, fragments of glass, porcelain stoppers, and a woman's silk ribbon bleached white. One captain swore he saw a face reflected beneath the surface, pale and motionless, drifting with the current until the waters turned black again. After the war, the school's basement was sealed for renovation. It never reopened. Modern records omit the incident entirely, yet workers repairing the foundation in 192 described the same odor of brine and decay rising through the cracks, and faintly the echo of humming below. The ledger itself survived in a private archive, its pages water, stained but legible, scrawled on the inside cover in a different hand from Dr. Hald's are 6 words: "Do not speak her name aloud." The recovered fragments by 1873, the Forsyth name had been nearly erased from parish record, yet Hollow's End was not forgotten. That year, a flood cut through the lower marsh, unearthing the stone foundation of the old cellar. Children scavenging near the ruins uncovered shards of glass glinting like teeth in the mud remnants of Forsyth's vessels. They sold them to a traveling antiquarian named Mr. Corbin Latch, who would later claim in correspondence that the fragments were uncommonly warm to the touch, even after washing. Latch was a collector of anatomical curiosities, his shop in New Orleans filled with reliquaries, bones, and what he called relics of transgression. He catalogued the pieces under a new heading, Artifacts of the Forsyth Phenomenon. Within months, scholars and dilettantes alike visited his rooms to glimpse the so-called marsh glass. Each visitor described the same sensation, a pressure behind the eyes, a faint vibration beneath the fingertips, as though something inside the glass was breathing still. One letter survives, dated October 2nd, 1873, addressed to Latch from a correspondent in Baton Rouge. "I held one of your shards to the light and swore I saw a face reflected within. It was not my own. The lips moved, though no sound escaped. I have not slept since." Shortly after, Latch fell ill. His journal, preserved in the Louisiana Historical Society, reveals that his symptoms defied ordinary diagnosis: fever, alternating with unnatural cold, lucid hours punctured by episodes of paralysis, during which he claimed to hear a woman weeping beneath the floorboards. He described dreams of the marsh flooded with torchlight, of figures standing waist, deep in black water, their eyes white as bone. Always, he said, there was the same whisper, "The pulse continues." Neighbors reported a sickly glow from his window at night, as if glass burned from within. When the constable broke in on November 5th, Latch was found seated before his display case, every fragment arranged in a circle on the floor. His face bore an expression of awe, not fear. The coroner's notes read only, "No sign of struggle, death consistent with asphyxia, eyes open, pupils contracted." Yet the official seal on his case file hides an omission. 3 fragments were missing from the circle. None were ever recovered. The shop passed briefly to his nephew, Henry Latch, who attempted to sell the remaining artifacts. He failed. Each time he brought them to market, buyers returned them within days, claiming cracks appeared overnight, spreading like veins beneath the surface. One man insisted he could hear whispering whenever the objects were near running water. By the turn of the century, the fragments had vanished into private hands. But their movement can be traced faintly through letters, auction records, and museum inventories, always reappearing under new names. Specimen 7, the hollow glass, the widow's eye. The last documented sighting came in 1902, when a crate matching their description was delivered to the University of St. John's Medical Museum under the entry donation anonymous. The crate was catalogued but never displayed. The curator's notes, rediscovered in the 1980s, close with a single line, "Do not place near mirrors. The reflection hums." Even now, among collectors of the obscure, there are rumors of a small glass shard that grows warm when held too long, its surface rippling faintly, like breath behind glass. They call it Eliner's fragment. The awakening of glass in the early months of 1903, a postgraduate physician named Dr. Walter H. Delane began studying the anonymous crate that had arrived at the University of St. John's. His diary, kept in steady, clinical prose until mid-year, soon drifted into something stranger, the tone unraveling with each entry. He began by recording temperatures, weights, and light measurements, noting that the shards emit a faint luminescence at dawn and dusk, proportional to ambient humidity. He believed this explained the myths of glowing artifacts in Hollow's End. But after 2 months, the patterns defied explanation. The glass no longer glowed with the marsh's dampness. Instead, it responded to proximity most vividly when he was alone. I leaned close. He wrote on May 14, 1903, and the surface distorted as though exhaling. The reflection formed not my own face, but that of an unfamiliar woman, pale and drenched, her mouth moving in rhythm with my breath. Delane was no mystic. He approached the matter as a pathologist, believing some chemical residue within the glass reacted to the oils of the skin. He began a regimen of daily exposure, testing its response to heat, blood, and saline. But within weeks, his notes turned erratic. Sentences trailed into sketches of branching lines, words repeating like refrains. It hums, it hums, the pulse beneath the pain. On June 3rd, his assistant, Mr. Keats, reported the doctor's eyes were veined as though by fine fractures, and that Delane had taken to muttering about resonant frequencies. That night, security found him standing barefoot in the darkened lab, every shard arranged upon the tiled floor in a perfect spiral. The pattern mirrored diagrams in Forsyth's 1834 journal, the same sigil drawn in the margin of his dissection ledgers. When questioned, Delane only replied, "I can hear her heartbeat now." After his dismissal, he continued privately in lodgings off Hanover Street. Neighbors complained of a low, rhythmic tapping at all hours, like water dripping inside the walls. The landlord, upon inspection, found a mirror turned to face the corner and a basin filled with cloudy water. Delane insisted it was for the reflection to breathe. His final diary entry, dated July 29th, reads, "There is movement beneath the surface now. The face grows clearer each night. It pleads, though not for release, rather for return. I believe she never died at all. The medium was the glass. The blood preserved her." 3 days later, Delane vanished. The door to his room was locked from the inside. His bed unslept, his coat hung neatly. In the basin remained only murky water and one fragment of glass, half dissolved as if melted from within. The floorboards beneath bore black stains in a spiral pattern, faintly iridescent under light. Witnesses swore they could still hear a humming from the empty room until the entire building was condemned and demolished in 1911. Yet, workmen later claimed that when the last wall came down, sunlight struck something inside, a single shard glinting, before sinking between the cracks of the stone foundation. It was never retrieved. In institutional reports, the case is listed as Delane anomaly, though archivists prefer to call it the Second Awakening, and with it, the Forsyth name, erased for nearly half a century, began whispering back through the archives. The Inheritance of the Pulse by 1915, the story of the Delane anomaly had faded from the university's corridors, filed away as rumor among night custodians and archivists who refused to work after dark. Yet beneath the quiet, a new thread emerged. A student archivist named Clara Bellamy was tasked with cataloging the private bequest of Professor Henry Latch, the nephew of the New Orleans collector who had once possessed the Marsh glass. Among the papers was a sealed envelope marked for the custodian of anatomy, should the pulse return. Inside were 3 folded letters and a fragment no larger than a coin, wrapped in faded muslin. The first letter was written in 1874, addressed to an unnamed doctor. The glass does not sleep. Each fracture hums when struck by thunder. I hear her at night, a slow knocking from inside the vessel. She asks for the remainder of herself. Clara documented the materials according to protocol, placing them in a specimen jar with distilled water. Within hours, she noted a fine mist forming on the inside of the glass, condensation, she wrote, but oddly rhythmic. By dawn, the mist had arranged itself into faint concentric circles, pulsing as though stirred by an unseen heart. Over the next weeks, Clara's ledger entries grew shorter, more personal. Her tone shifted from curiosity to compulsion. The pulse is steady now. I can feel it in my palms when I handle the fragment. It beats faster when I think of her. Her colleagues dismissed her behavior as exhaustion. She began working alone, staying in the basement archives until morning. When her supervisor demanded the specimen be sealed away, she refused, insisting that it listens and will not tolerate silence. In December of 1915, she was last seen descending the stairs carrying the jar and a hand mirror. Later that evening, a janitor discovered water seeping beneath the archive door. The floor was slick, reflecting a faint blue light. No trace of Clara remained, save for her notebook, drenched and warped by moisture. The final page bore a single phrase, scrawled over and over until the paper tore. She is almost whole. A formal inquiry followed, and the entire archive was relocated to an upper floor. The muslin wrapping was never recovered, and the jar's contents had evaporated, leaving only crystalline residue that shimmered under lamplight. The university sealed the case and forbade mention of it in public lectures. But Clara's brother, Samuel Bellamy, a physician with the Royal Army Medical Corps, began corresponding with St. John's that same winter. His letters reveal that Clara had sent him a small envelope weeks before her disappearance, containing what she called a keepsake from the marsh. He never specified its contents, only that it reacted strangely to light, and that he carried it in a locket around his neck during his service in France. In 1917, Samuel was listed missing in action at Ypres. His effects were returned to London the following year. Among them, the locket melted from within. The army surgeon who inspected it described the metal as distorted, as though from internal combustion, though no heat marks touched the surrounding cloth. By then, the fragment's trail vanished once more. Yet certain physicians who served with Bellamy swore that, during lulls in artillery fire, they could hear a sound not unlike the beating of a heart coming from the mud, steady, patient, and impossibly near. It was the same rhythm Forsyth had once recorded almost a century earlier. The pulse had crossed generations. The persistence beneath glass and blood, the trail of the Forsyth phenomenon seemed, for a time, to end with the mud of Ypres. Yet by 1932, an unmarked collection arrived at the newly established Marshfield Institute of Medical History in Boston, a donation from an anonymous estate in Sussex. Inside were boxes of scorched paper, glass slides labeled Hollow's End, and a weathered leather-bound volume bearing the name Dr. T. Forsyth, 1034-1841, the director, Dr. Miriam Huxley, described the condition of the materials as damp but curiously fragrant, as though the pages had absorbed something organic. She spent that winter cataloging the papers, often working late by the soft hum of the Institute's archival lamps. The janitor would later recall hearing a faint tapping from her office each night, like someone knocking on the inside of a window pane. Huxley's correspondence reveals she had become convinced that Forsyth's work represented an early attempt at cellular reanimation through chemical suspension decades before Pasteur or Koch. His notes contained diagrams of human tissue preserved within a vitreous medium. The fluid, he claimed, could retain electrical and hereditary resonance. It was pseudoscience, yet the handwriting, calm, precise, almost reverent, lent the theory a disturbing plausibility. Among the papers was a familiar sigil, a spiral of concentric lines annotated pulse frequency 47-2. The same symbol appeared beside Delane's final entry in 1903 and in Clara Bellamy's soaked notebook. The pattern persisted, copied across decades by hands that never met. When Dr. Huxley began cross-referencing the slides, she noted that several still contained fine veins of living tissue, faintly pink, faintly moving. She sealed the slides in sterilized cases, but the motion continued. Her last letter to a colleague reads, "It has adapted to the glass. The cells have memory, perhaps intention. When I hold the slide near light, they align as though recognizing the shape of a face." On April 7, 1933, she locked her office and did not return. When staff entered days later, they found her microscope overturned, her chair facing the window. The glass slides were missing. The desk bore damp rings and fingerprints embedded in dust, as if from hands pressing upward through the wood. The authorities ruled it a nervous collapse. The Institute sealed the Forsyth collection, shipping it to deep storage, yet rumors spread that, on humid nights, the sealed vault door fogs from within, leaving faint spiral traces. Some claim the fog pulses steady, human. Years later, a single slide appeared in a private sale in Massachusetts. It was described only as an antique specimen of unknown origin, faintly luminous. The buyer remains unnamed. But the auctioneer's assistant later reported that the slide throbbed when handled and that, for a brief instant, she saw a reflection in its glass that was not her own, a woman's face, pale and calm, lips moving soundlessly. That was in 1989. The slide has never resurfaced. Epilogue whispered sometimes. Archivists say, if you walk the lower halls of Marshfield at night, you can hear it. Not footsteps, not whispers, but a slow, deliberate pulse echoing through the pipes. Some nights it syncs with your own heartbeat, and if you stop breathing, you can almost tell which of you beats first. The pulse continues.